Have you all here with us today so we can celebrate the spooky season together, which is one of my personal favorite seasons because it's so much fun. I should have dressed up. What a bummer.
Would have been a good day for it, right?
Yeah, it would have been a great day for it. We are stoked, like I said, to have you all here. It seems like most of you guys know who Jon is, though. Yeah? So I guess I don't really have to go into much detail, but Jon here lives in Helena, so he traveled up today to hang out with us, and he's a big part of the Helena community and is the owner of White Knight Games and Hobby Shop with his brother Joel. He can be found regularly there, even in his off time, rolling dice and recreating historical battles with miniature armies, which sounds super fun. He also notes that he reads more than is possibly good for him, which is probably part of what makes writing a lot of fun, I'm assuming. I guess we'll learn more about that.
That's a big part. We don't like to read the partnership, right?
Fair enough. I wanted to also share that his two books that we have here, Stained Echoes and The Dreadful Call, will be officially in our circulation starting next week. So people from the public can actually start checking this out and reading the stories as well. And we are thrilled to include them in our Montana selection. So any of the books that have an M on them in our collection means that they are Montana authors. So they get a little bit more of a special identification on our shelves. So be sure to keep an eye out for this next week, but I can guarantee you one of these will be off the shelves because it will be with me as soon as it's able to be circulated. So you might have to wait for one of them. But without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Jon Ring to the stage.
All right, thank you. I'm very stoked about that particular thing. Getting in a library, I think, for any author is amazing and something you probably shoot for. And honestly, it hadn't really impressed me how much I'm very stoked about that. So, like I said, for Jon Ring, coincidentally, yesterday, I heard back from Far Country Press and my third book was done. So I brought that one today as well, and that is Sinister Traits. All my books have a similar theme. I like horror, I write horror as a result. I don't particularly like visceral horror, I like horror of the mind, or that sort of thing. So either psychological horror or, you know, there may be supernatural elements or something like that, but I don't like to get super graphic. So, all three of these books also have in common, they're all short stories. I really love the American short story, so that's what I'm kind of drawn towards to write. And because they're horror-based, I thought 13 stories in each one seems like a good idea. And somehow each time I'm able to make it all fit around 400 pages, and I don't know how I managed to do that, to be honest. Some stories sometimes do get pulled, because they're like, well, that was not going to fit in, I'll fit that in another one. So that did happen with some of the stuff from Stained Echoes. I'm like, that's like a 500-page book, that's way too long for short stories. So it had to get pulled and put somewhere else. But I'm going to read you a story, and since it's the Halloween season, I decided I'm going to definitely do one from the new book, which kind of screwed up my plans because I already decided months ago what I was going to read, but I want to do one of these now. And I'm going to do one of the supernatural ones. I'll either do supernatural a lot of times, or I do more like a thriller sort of thing also. So, but it's the Halloween season, so I'm thinking spooky's probably the way to go. We'll go into that, and then after that, if anybody has any more questions for me, I'll be more than glad to answer any. I chose is called The Recent Poltergeist. Chose it for a couple of reasons. One, it's a nice supernatural story. It's one of those which fits the theme. But then also, it's not too long because we only have a limited amount of time. So, One thing I love with my books also is I work with an artist in Helena. Her name is Vanessa, and she just helps really my stories a lot because with every story, she does an illustration inside each. And so this was a particular illustration for the storyline. The door was locked. That unto itself was not entirely surprising. The Russells lived in a fairly decent neighborhood, not too great, but not the slums either. The street which their house was situated on went by the designation of Camelot Boulevard, a lofty and somewhat romantic name that seemed very much at odds with its very normal appearances. It was populated mostly by blue-collar working families, similar to Ashley and Donald themselves, who worked 40-hour-plus weeks for what little money they had. Like many people nowadays, everyone kept to themselves. Interest in your neighbor's business was frowned upon, if not outright discouraged. Ashley's astonishment with the door stemmed more with the fact that both the Russells had agreed to start locking it only recently after a family down the street had been the scene of a burglary in broad daylight, and with the owners at home. Even in such a close-mouthed community, such blatant crime could not go unnoticed. Reportedly, things had gotten physical quickly during the altercation. However, one of the homeowners had managed to drive off the assailant before the incident had escalated further. Nevertheless, this was not done without some cost. Both the wife and husband had been cut by the knife-wielding maniac. She was particularly severe, requiring multiple stitches as well as the possibility of corrective, albeit minor, surgery later. The police were currently on the lookout for the suspect, their productivity enhanced considerably by a faithful description provided by the couple. Be that as may, Ashley Rousseau and her husband Donald had talked over the subject over the night before, and both agreed that securing the house, both when they left and when they returned, was the prudent thing to practice in the meantime. Her adjustment to the arrangement, however, was much more difficult, especially when Ashley, her arms burdened down with 3 bags of groceries that included frozen confectionaries, was used to walking right into her residence without any sort of hindrance. Since she had expected it to be unfastened, she had acted accordingly, trying to twist the knob to open the door and shove instead of fishing out the needed key from the depths of her purse. The fact that Donald's car was plainly sitting in the driveway had only reinforced that regular contact on her part. He was obviously home from work. The resulting crash into the immovable surface of the starboard door had raised her ire, and she punched the doorbell with vicious force in response, in a small way venting her frustration on the hapless object. As an entire minute went by with no sign of her husband, her pique ascended to a higher degree of elevation. Forced to accept the fact that Donald would not be coming to unlock the door anytime soon, she placed the loaded plastic bags on the concrete stairs with peevish impatience and slung her purse forward. Unzipping the pocketbook with more than adequate force, Ashley hunted down and around until she triumphantly found the required items sandwiched between a half-full pack of gum and some old receipts she hadn't bothered to throw away yet. Sliding the key into the lock, she rotated it fully to the right, then bent over to pick up the discarded foodstuffs. As she turned the handle with its unfastener still securely in the tumbler and pulled outward simultaneously, she was surprised to discover the egress did not open as expected. Rechecking the position of the key, Ashley saw it was now parallel to the vertical direction of the entryway instead of perpendicular as it should have been. That's strange, she thought. I could have sworn I shot the bolt all the way back. The contrary evidence to that assertion stared at her, brooking no argument. I guess it really wasn't. She performed the task again, this time opening the door wide before retrieving the groceries. Inside was cool, despite the stifling heat rushing in from outside. As she stepped through the entryway, Ashley kicked the offending party shut behind her with a practiced leg. No sense in making the poor air conditioning work harder than it was already. Donald said it could go any day now, and always complained when she turned it low, past 75. He was used to the extremes of weather in his outdoor job as a sprinkler installer. She, with her domestic occupation as a school secretary, was not. If the machine broke, it would not be replaced with any urgency, and she would be the one to suffer. As she walked across the small vestibule, she began making her way to the kitchen to lighten her load. She had always liked the name vestibule for the front entryway. It made it sound fancy. The real estate agent that sold them the house had used the term, though in actuality the room amounted to little more than a wide space in the hall. As she did so, she called out, somewhat less friendly to her usual tone, to her marriage partner. "Don, didn't you hear me at the door? Some help would have been appreciated. Where are you at?" Silence welcomed her ungracious greeting. "He must be somewhere in the back," she surmised. "Men, never around when you need them." As she turned around the interceding wall that separated the hallway from the living room, she saw the rows of glass figures lined, as always, on their 3 large curio cabinets. They were her most prized possessions. Some were gifts from her husband, brought back without fail each time from the places he visited while on out-of-town jobs. Others she had inherited from her mother and grandmother, from their own collections after they passed. Most, however, were simple purchases made by Ashley herself from time to time, bought with a discerning eye aimed at furthering her crystal menagerie. And what a zoo it had become. Shiny bears cavorted on striped balls among delicate sleeping fawns. Transparent otters swam with tiny fish in their clenched jaws past fiery cats sunning themselves to the incandescent bulbs overhead. Purple elephants raised their trunks in triumphant shouts, calling to the demure horses and rabbits to come play. Stalwart mastiffs, with their backs as stiff as wooden planks, guarded the collection with their tinted glass beads for eyes that never blinked. Ashley's gaze swept around her translucent garden automatically, her thoughts occupied elsewhere. 2 matters were of importance at the moment. The first was the completion of her task, the expediting of which was enhanced by the limited nature of the melting ice cream inside the bags. The second, a distant concern at best, was still the undetermined location of her missing husband. But her subconscious, observing and cataloging the arrayed figures with efficiency, noticed a small empty space where a miniature swan was supposed to be. This was not just any old swan. It was a heirloom from her grandmother's effects. The older woman had received the figure from her own husband, a present from Venice while he was stationed overseas in the war. It was hand-blown by elite craftsmen, masters that followed the same tireless principles as their forefathers, and now it was gone. Urgency to find the missing antique replaced all other considerations. Ashley rushed forward, her eyes roving the ground and nearby furniture. She moved past the living room to the compact dining area, making her way around the small table and chairs where the 2 shared their meals. "What the heck," she raged. "If Donald did something with that one, I'll never forgive him." Then she found the missing signet, and Ashley's jaw dropped. The previously significant sacks fell from numb fingers to the floor unheeded as she surveyed the wreckage that had been her pride and joy, the translucent swan. It lay shattered on the carpet in front of the unexpectedly closed kitchen door. In a dull haze, she observed there were 4 larger pieces surrounded by numerous shards, splinters, and dust. The sight captivated her. In a way, it was appalling as when she had seen its previous owner last, shriveled and lifeless in her casket. For a long while, she stared at the destroyed remnants, the loss overwhelming in its finality. Then a small warmth began to grow in the pit of her stomach, rising from the ashes to the forefront of her perception, blazing away at the staggering shock until only it remained. Pure, intense anger, seeking the culprit, took over. There was no room for anything else, not accident, nor explanation, or even reason. Ashley hammered at the blockaded kitchen entrance, her hands curled in twin fists of fury. The mirror hanging on the wall to her left reflected her maddened image, a woman brought to the brink. Heedless of the dual impression, she cried out as she struck against the unyielding surface, her words accusatory and feral. "How could you, you son of a..." Her screams exploded in tandem with her assaults, the expletives caustic enough to melt the cheerful yellow paint covering the target's surface. A frenzied hand accosted the handle below, yanking with savage effect. "You bastard, you know how much that meant to me." Her assaults were answered suddenly, not with the opening of the door, but in the same manner, a brutal pounding that seemed to shake the very house to its foundations. Ashley felt the knob in her hand attempt to twist, the strength of its movement overcoming her own exertions, now turning in the opposite direction. An unfamiliar voice roared from behind the barrier, startling the emotionally charged woman out of her own paroxysm. There were no words. It was a primal scream that terrified her, replacing the anger with fear. Nor was that the only occurrence at that particular moment. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw slight movement. Turning to face this new development, its abnormality made the deafening onslaught at the kitchen entryway fade into the background, forgotten and inconsequential. Her glass figurines were moving, apparently under their own volition. She watched with a mixture of horror and awe, too thunderstruck to respond. One of the circus bears floated off the shelf, followed by an inquisitive raccoon. They were quickly joined by a host of other crystalline creatures, hovering and bouncing as if by an unseen piper of Hamlin. They twirled and spun with magnificent precision. Glints of light passed through them in erratic but beautiful displays. Then one came wafting toward steady strokes, as if under the influence of petite puffs of silent wind. Ashley recognized the clear form, that of a tiny ballerina. It was the least favorite of her possessions, a gift from her husband before she trained him for likes and dislikes. She had considered removing the unwanted dancer from his place among her treasured things numerous times in the past. It just didn't fit the others. However, now her eyes followed it with shocked applause as it pirouetted around with dainty revolutions. The spinning entertainer came to a stop only when it reached the mirror parallel from her own position. There it paused before commencing to an act of arbitrary vandalism on the surface of the looking glass. With even, deft strokes, the ballerina was drawn across the reflective veneer, scratching squeals and shrieks of protest that hurt Ashley's ears. At any other time, she would have halted such sacrilege, its perpetrator immediately chastened for such untoward behavior. But with the possible preternatural origin of whatever psychic influence caused the manifestation stilled her responses, allowing its screeching progress to continue uninterrupted. The abrasions resolved into letters, which in turn became words. The result was a simple two-word message. Anybody read that? Yeah. Okay. The context seemed direct, undoubtedly directed at herself alone. Yet she stayed, trapped by the crescendo of overpowering stimuli assaulting her from all directions. The continued pounding at the closed door, the whirling and gyrating figurines executing their aerial dance, and the growing sense of dread emanating from within herself combined to root her stance to its current location. The improvised writing instrument began to move again. The head of the ballerina was now crushed with the unseen force that was animated in its nameless purpose. It was a continuation of the previous message, adding and clarifying. Still that? The sight of her name cut through the fog of her inaction, breaking the spell of impotence upon her. Sound flooded into her ears again, and the guttural exclamations from the kitchen coalesced into recognizable speech, taking her attention from the otherworldly messages carving into the mirror. The wooden frame was now shuddering and buckling under the hysterical ministrations of the phantom speaker, as whatever it seemed intent on breaching the impediment between Ashley and themselves. "I'll kill you, let me out!" The voice beyond the kitchen door continued to snarl and swear, promising obscene tortures that even a seasoned masochist would blanch from the mirth's mention. Ashley, however, heard none of the remaining threats after the initial French shouting. She was done. She ran for the front door, tripping and slipping in her haystacks in the dwelling. Ashley ripped the entrance open and flew down the steps. It was a miracle she did not fall on the uneven obstacles before. Her mind raced as fast as her feet, finally able to draw conclusions from the extraordinary event. "A ghost," she frantically conjectured. "A freaking poltergeist has invaded my house." That her house was haunted now, she was certain beyond a shadow of doubt. The evidence had been unequivocal, the proof right before her very eyes. Ashley saw a woman across the street leaving her home with all the normalcy that should have been Ashley's own. The lady was unknown to her. They'd never been introduced. None of that mattered anymore. Screaming at the top of her lungs, she made for the island of salvation. The woman half turned to Ashley's outrageous behavior, her ordinary day now interrupted by a dose of derangement. Surprise shattered the placid expression in her eyes. She raised her arms in protest, questioning the dubious intentions of this mad woman closing in on her. What's going on? What do you want? Between agitated mouthfuls of air, Ashley told her, "There's something in my house, something wrong. You have to help me. You have to do something." She stopped in mid-sentence as she became aware of another horrifying fact. "Oh my God, Donald, my husband's still in there. We have to do something. He needs help." This was enough to convince the neighbor of her dilemma. The woman whipped out her cell phone, dialing 911. Ashley only heard bits and pieces of the resulting conversation. Her thoughts were on her missing partner inside the house of horrors. He was alone with that thing. Who knew what might happen to him? The woman's own husband emerged, slamming the screen door as he exited. With his wife's help, they restrained Ashley from attempting to re-enter the building and cross the street. The cops were on their way, they reassured her. She needed to wait for them. A teenage boy from another house came to see the bus. He was joined by others from almost every home in the neighborhood within moments. Evidently, there was nothing like a distraught housewife to bring community together. Even the police arrived with what seemed like impossible speed instead of their more normal, sedate approach. Later, she would learn they were only a block away, almost within earshot of her cries. Two uniformed patrolmen approached her and took her statement. Ashley gave it with hurried distractness to somewhat skeptical looks from the authoritative men. She was informed to stay put, along with the still growing crowd of onlookers. One of the officers walked back to their car and spoke a few terse sentences into the radio. She could not make out the words. Notwithstanding any probable reservations on their part, the pair crossed the street to the scene of the bizarre happenings. They both drew their guns before entering. At least her feverish story had convinced them that there was some danger inside. The mob outside waited with breathless anticipation, every ear cocked to hear the sounds of struggle, perhaps hoping for a report of gunfire to issue from the depths of the silent, foreboding house. They were to be disappointed in that regard. Their watchfulness continued for several more terse minutes. After a short while, a few bystanders began to leave as the time passed, without any clear resolution, assuming that the uncommon exhibition was apparently a dud. Another police vehicle arrived, then a third, along with an ambulance and a fire truck. Some of the newcomers on the scene attempted to disperse the milling crowd. Their efforts seemed to amplify the pandemonium rather than to de-escalate it. Two patrolmen, after consulting their probable radios, moved around to the rear of the building. Sweat trickled on every face among those present. Though whether the source was the stifling heat or the swelling tension, none could say for certain. Those of the mob who remained steadfast throughout the ordeal were rewarded at last for their persistent vigilance. The two initial officers reappeared with a struggling young man. He was handcuffed, his face ruddy from his incessant attempts to escape. His long hair uneven and greasy looking. His shirt and pants were covered in shocking crimson, dark splotches that contrasted sharply against the paleness of his clothing. Ashley wailed at the sight of the drying blood, guessing the macabre portent of its source. The surrounding crowd made prefatory comments of consolation that failed to reach her hearing. Her eyes were glued on the scene before and its terrible implications that could change her life forever. The suspect was shoved into the rear of a waiting patrol car with ungracious persuasiveness. He gawped through the window at the swarm of spectators, amazed at the sheer size of the large gathering. Some members of the assembly stared back, and some took impromptu photos. He did not have to stay the subject of scrutiny for long. The car he was secured in withdrew, presumably to a holding cell. The paramedic crew entered the premises next, carrying a stretcher between them. In the space of their departure, a patrolman approached Ashley. He spoke, but she could barely hear him. Something about a stuck door saving her. Her unwavering attention was at the front entrance of her home. The two EMTs returned from their appointed chore, laden with a suspicious burden concealed under a white cloth. They loaded their charge into the ambulance. A chance breeze plucked at the sheet, lifting it from its place atop the gurney. A quick hand fell from the fluttering fabric before it could blow away, but not in time to prevent Ashley from destroying what lay beneath its shroud. The face of her husband, pallid and inert, stared back at her with lifeless eyes. She began to shriek anew, then blackness overtook her senses. You drink. It's a good stopping point, too. The funeral had been over a week ago. Ashley had not returned to the site of Donald's murder since that fateful day when her life was turned upside down. She was staying with her sister throughout the trying times. Jennifer was by her side as Ashley faced the entrance to the place she used to call home. There was no way, her sister had stated, that Ashley could go to that abandoned house alone. Details of her husband's murder were only just now being revealed by the press. Loathsome specifics that pierced together his tragic last moments. He had come home and left the front door unlocked, disregarding the careful preparations they had agreed to the day before. The killer, perhaps hiding outside somewhere in concealment, seized the opportunity and entered unnoticed by Donald. There had been a struggle between the two in the living room, ending with horrific finality in the kitchen. Donald had been stabbed over 30 times, most post-mortem. His expiration had been fairly instantaneous after the first few thrusts, the coroner reassured her. A favorable stroke of luck under the circumstances. Ashley had been compelled to hold herself back from slapping him, as if anything could be fortunate said about the malicious murder of her husband of 11 years. At least the medical examiner gave the time of death as a half hour before she had arrived. She couldn't have lived with herself knowing he'd still been alive when she ran from the building. Her sister had organized the cleanup inside. The cleanup. There was another euphemism that made no sense to her. It felt so sterile, as if they had eradicated a minor problem. A simple stain on the carpet instead of the residue from Donald's heinous murder. She had stated her reason to return to the house was to collect a few articles of clothing and other sundry items she needed. Jennifer protested, offering to gather the things herself. She was just trying to be supportive, as she had done during the entirety of Ashley's stay at her home. The widowed woman wouldn't hear of it, however. Only she knew where certain things were located, and she had to face the empty dwelling sooner or later. Might as well be sooner, she reasoned. As she steeled herself to walk inside the house she had exited in terror weeks earlier, the outright fallacy of that statement haunted her with every step up to the long trek to the door. After her frenzied, half-understood story to the two officers right before they entered the residence, she had chosen to keep quiet about her experiences inside. It had been too crazy to be believed by anyone. She herself, after so much time elapsing since the incident, could scarcely contemplate its authenticity. That was the real purpose of why Ashley came to the residence, instead of the multitude of excuses she explained to her sister. The small entryway was cool when they entered, despite the air conditioning being turned off while she was away. They traveled down the hall to the master bedroom at the rear of the home. There she slipped some apparel to take with her and set Jennifer to collecting the other items on her list from the bathroom. While her dutiful sister attended to her task, Ashley ventured back into the hallway. She followed it until turning right into the living room. The glass figurines sat in their accustomed places, not one of them out of place, with the exception of the broken swan. Could she have imagined their unnatural flight, a trick of her mind during a stressful situation? It couldn't be. She had seen them fly. Nevertheless, in the harsh light of day, surrounded by the glaring proof of the quite ordinary, very familiar scene to her, it was easy to believe such a logical theory could be true. Then she saw the kitchen door, still closed like she had saw it last. What happened and who had been waiting behind that barrier she fortunately did not discover that fateful day, but the horror, the pounding fists, and the raspy growls came back in a flood through her memories. The man behind that door had wanted to kill her, just as he had her husband. She closed her eyes, trying to will away the tremors that accompanied the painful recollection. The terrible, fanatical voice echoed in her mind, louder than anything, louder than the high-speed shrieks of the protesting glass being scratched. She opened her eyes wide and turned toward the hanging mirror. The words that were scraped into its glimmering surface still remained, a terrible corroboration that what happened when the disaster day was real and not just fantasy. But it was not the twin messages of warning that held her attention for so long. It was a third line of text, apparently written after she had bolted from the room, but carved with the familiar script as before. A handwriting she should have recognized earlier is from someone she knew very well indeed, someone who had saved her life that day from beyond. The simple word farewell read. That's it. Like that story?
Yeah, that was from your new book?
Yep, that was from that.
Fantastic.
It's one of the shorter ones, the other ones are longer.
Yeah.
We don't have time for that. But with this one, it kind of forms a trilogy with the other ones, because in some of the stories, not that one we just had there, there's things that harken back to stories from like the first book or the second book and stuff, and I did that with the second book also. You can read them in order, however, it's never necessary with the stories. They all are designed to stand alone, but it's just kind of easier. You're like, oh wait, I know what that person's talking about in the first story. I just thought it would be a fun thing to do, kind of build a universe at the same time, even though all the stories are different. That's not me talking. Does anyone else have any questions, or?
Which one is the first one?
The Dreadful Call.
Okay. Dreadful Call, and Stained Echoes is the second.
That's the second one. Yep.
Okay. Keep it in my brain.
I changed my format in that one too. So I left the longest story at the end in the first book, and then I got feedback from people that I should not do that. Like, I thought that was gonna be short too, and just went on and on. I'm like, I don't feel like it's work. Changed it completely the way I did that one. Because I usually do one longer one, and then all the rest are true short stories. So the longer ones are always kind of like novellas, I guess.
Where do you get your inspiration?
So a lot of it comes from personal experiences. Not that I get people murdered all the time or anything like that, but it'll just, I don't know, it's wild. I was reading this thing one time, and then like Stephen King said it, because he did this book about writing, and I read his book, and I was like, that has a lot to do with me. And he said, so let's say I go to a lake, and I see this lake, and then, you know what I'm gonna write after I see this lake? I'm gonna write a story about some monster coming out of the lake and grabbing people and pulling them down. He's like, on the flip side, let's say you had Louis L'Amour, he's gonna see that, write some story about water rights. So, and he said that's just the nature of what it is. Whenever you're a writer, you're drawn to whatever genre, I think is the best way to put it. And for me, I'm kind of drawn to that. I do a couple of comedies sometimes too, because I always feel they're kind of close to each other. So in two of the books, there's like this one, the last story, I'll just let you know, it's a comedy. And then one in the middle, Stained Echoes, is a comedy. But my comedy is generally black, I'll just let you know.
When you get into spooky stuff,
Mm-hmm.
like in the story you just read where you got into the stabbing description,
Sure.
and it was a little bit further detailed than 30 stab wounds and her reaction. Maybe that her reaction helps, but do you ever spook yourself and worry about your reading audience because you're getting into areas where you're not supposed to think like that and other people might judge?
Well, you do have to think about that, because when you put your work out there, everybody has seen it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now they're like, well, I don't really know what you have out there. So there was a story I wrote in Stained Echoes. I'm like, I think I pushed the envelope too far on this one. And then I read a review from some guy in Italy who just happened to pick up my book and read it, and he left an online review, and he said that was one of the best stories he ever read in his life. So I'm like, well, I guess it was okay to put that one in there then. He's like, that's the best one in the book, partner. I'm like, okay. And my wife doesn't like horror. So she doesn't really like a lot of my stories, to be honest. And she said that one, she's like, that's horrifying, John.
Which one is that one? I have it
It's
here.
Feasting Fritz. I'll warn you on that one.
Oh.
It's a Montana story too.
What was the name of it?
Feasting Fritz.
Feasting Fritz.
Yep.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You didn't mind. Mark that one.
Yeah, it's in my brain.
Doesn't like this one. Okay. Now that makes me want to read it.
Fascinating.
That's funny you bring that up, because then also I have another person, I have her read a lot of my stories sometimes and give me feedback, because she doesn't like horror. And I think it's good sometimes to have people who don't like your genre give you feedback, because then they're kind of not looking through rose-tinted glasses sometimes. Because people like horror generally like horror. They'll forget things. They'll be like, oh, okay, that's fine, or something like that. The biggest thing I think when I write a story and then someone who doesn't like horror reads it and likes it, I'm like, I did a good job. So with her, she was like, well, I like a lot of your stories and stuff, but sometimes I feel, it's always going to be doom and gloom. So actually with this one, I actually felt like at the end of that one, it's not super all doom. So just change things up sometimes. Because then when you do the doom and gloom, it's on the sweeter later. So now I'm like, oh, he's not going to do that.
That's funny.
I see that The Dreadful Call has a Benjamin Franklin Award.
Yes.
What was that like?
That was pretty cool, especially for my first book. Didn't really think something like that would ever going to happen. But evidently they read it and they just loved it. So it was in their horror category, but even to get the nomination was like super awesome. I didn't win. I'll just let you know that. But the other guy did a
I don't know if this says winner on it, so winner of some sort.
winner of some sort.
Second loser, right?
Yeah, they said it was second loser. But no, I was very proud of that. So, and then like every other writer is everything. I always think the newest thing I wrote is better than everything I've ever written before. So I'm like, but let's try this one again and see if I can actually be like top winner this time. So,
Yeah.
it's, in a way, it's kind of like validation. It's like, okay, you go to all this effort writing, and it takes a lot of time. And unfortunately, the fun part is the writing part, and then you do editing, and that part's not fun at all. It's like, here's this wonderful sentence, man, it's garbage. Rip it out, replace it with something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it turns into work. But
How long do you figure that one took to write?
this one took a long time, actually, compared to the other ones. So the second one, I finished within 2 years, I want to say, from publication for the first one coming out. And this one, I think we're a little longer on that, but more like 3. So, because it was also early that year, so this one was like 3 and change. And partly that was me, to be honest, because I was just like, I wanted everything to be perfect. So I just went over it and went over it and went over it. And then also worked with people who, I was very pleased to have a young man really be willing to work with me. He was going to school at Carroll College to be an editor. And so he was willing to read and give me feedback. I've always had an editor go over my stuff, but there's different when being paid when they're doing that as a labor of love. When this guy doing a labor of love, he must have spent 100 hours like helping me, as opposed to someone you pay. So well, you pay him and you get what you pay for, right? So yeah, so I think he did a wonderful job, because then if I didn't working, he was not shy about telling you that, so which was nice.
Question, say a good writer shows his stories instead of telling his stories. How do you show your stories versus telling what you want to say?
Oh, yeah, I've heard that said too. And I do agree with that to a long part. You want to show, so actually I was talking to this gentleman before we all started here, and I was saying to him, we were talking about sometimes works that seem to get put out, sometimes don't seem like there's a lot of work that goes into them, or they get shoveled out, which then gives a lot of other works a bad name, to be quite honest. So, and people are always like, especially in this new age thought of writing, show, don't tell, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. It's like drilled into everyone. Always show, never tell. And I will agree with that 99% of the time, but sometimes you do have to tell to keep everybody on track. And they'll tell me I'm wrong, but I won't. I do think sometimes you have to explain things, because if someone doesn't understand what's going on, they can't enjoy the stuff. So really, you got to go through and make sure when you're explaining something, it is absolutely explained just like if they were viewing it themselves. Does that make sense? That kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of heard, I'm a Bush League journalist,
Sure. Oh,
web
cool.
content, stuff like that for many
Yeah.
years. And I kind of heard journalistic enthusiasm in your story. I'm quite a bit like, I like the story idea more than I care about the craftsmanship and the teacup, like I was saying.
Sure.
Quite a bit. I like to hear the story. I want to know what happens, right?
Right?
And I was reading, what's the guy who wrote Fight Club? Inordinately famous guy that
I know his name, but.
everybody has to imitate
Yeah.
that guy these days because he's the contemporary genius. But he even makes lots of comments in his criticism and stuff that journalists tend to have better stories, more enthusiasm about the story itself than just like how to build a metaphor.
Right?
Yeah, I was listening to yours and I thought, yeah, there's another guy that likes to tell stories. More like,
Well, it's
I
like,
think show no tell can be underrated.
right?
Like the opening line must be the perfect teacup and my grandmother and and three different senses and
Right?
no, I like it when people tell a decent story, that's all.
Yeah, as long as it's on here, I mean, that's why we want to read, is
Yeah.
to be entertained just like with anything else, and if you're
Well,
not being
that's-
entertaining,
It seems like it could be knick-knack distraction. I mean,
right?
the story had movement.
Right? Gotta keep things progressive,
Yeah.
you know, and when I heard you laugh during the one part, I was like, she got the joke.
Do you want to read another one?
Ooh,
Do you think that we have time for another one?
yeah, if I do a small one, if anybody else wants me to. Yeah? All right, cool, that's good. Let's see here. I had a second one picked out, one was short, but I warned you, there's no supernatural in this one. All the other supernatural ones are way too long. But it's a good story still. Let's see here. You know what? I'm gonna switch, and I'm gonna go with another book, actually, because there's one. It's really, my wife says it's one of the best stories I've read, so we're gonna go with that.
Yeah.
It's called The Secret Place. The small diner's overall appearance was a bit run down, but it still had plenty of that country charm that welcomed in the highway's hungry travelers with its faded promises of well-cooked steaks, juicy burgers, and of course, delectable pies. There is nothing quite as American as a lonely diner in the middle of nowhere, Chris thought to himself. It epitomized the concept of capitalism, the roadside cafes springing up wherever there is high enough demand and profit from the hungry truckers and other fellow travelers of the road. This is not a business for the large corporations that dominate trade in overcrowded cities and metropolitan areas, too small a fish for their colossal appetites. The spirit of the individual entrepreneur still reigns supreme here instead. The owners of such establishments, by necessity, fulfill roles in their own day-to-day operations, whether it be a waitress, cook, or busboy, lending a touch of pride and homely familiarity that has long since been lost by their larger urban counterparts. Chris had been on the road since he left Billings late last night and had pushed on through several hundred miles of flat, almost desolate farmland of eastern Montana without any rest or food since the beginning of his trek. I think everybody here can agree that that's what that road feels like. A dilapidated billboard had first caught his attention a few miles back, advertising the Avalon Cafe. The sign had the colorful inscription, "Home of the best grub on this side of the Rockies," plastered across a photo of an overflowing table covered with various entrees and desserts from end to end. The suspicious sight of the food had reminded him of his unintentional fast, and his stomach churned noisily in response to the scrumptious imagery. Once the thought of substance had entered his mind, there had been no dissuading the notion, nor any real reason that he could think of avoiding stopping. He had made good time previously on the freeway with his 80 miles per hour allowance in speed, and even after slowing down to the max 70 on the smaller highway, he was still well ahead of the schedule he had set for himself. Chris pulled into the dirt parking lot with an eagerness he firmly hoped would be the unassuming establishment would be able to live up to. He parked and got out, sidestepping the numerous puddles from the previous night's rain, much too early as of yet for the sun's warmth to dry them up. The glass front doors swung open easily, and a small bell above it chimed noisily to announce his entrance to the diner. Several wooden tables covered in red and white tablecloths were scattered about the front sitting area, and with relatively plain metal-backed chairs tucked neatly underneath the edges of them. Smaller booths surrounded the exterior of the cafeteria next to their walls. There are solid frameworks handcrafted with natural logs and then heavily stained to withstand aging and use. Metal paper napkin dispensers stood at attention next to accompanying condiment cavities. They held ketchup and mustard for burgers, syrup and butter for pancakes, creamers and sugars for coffee, and every table's old standby, salt and pepper. Face-down coffee cups and assorted utensils were available at the majority of the seats, save for a few farther away from them. A smaller open area to the right of the main cafeteria seemed to hold more than tables and booths, but an interior wall that ran along that side obscured his view of it. The long white counter was lined with stools for long seating, and it separated the customer area from the waitress's domain. A small aisle ran deep behind the immense countertop, with a matching wall on the opposite side. The wall was covered with metal shelving that held plates, bowls, and other eating utensils. The entire area was taken up by the collection, save for a small pass-through that connected to the kitchen, which allowed the waitress to send orders to the cook and receive completed entrees back in kind. A small old-fashioned register sat atop a shorter fixture that stood at the end of the white counter. The antique bronze surface polished and gleaming beneath the cheerful yellow glare of the lights. The smaller side of the restaurant was easier to see at this angle, and he could barely make out a swinging door, presumably leading to the kitchen itself. However, the most arresting sight in the little cafe was on the walls themselves. Various paintings and watercolors, all neatly framed and artfully arranged to display their best vantage to the observer, took up nearly every space available on a surface. He was about to investigate further into their composition when a young girl, possibly in her 20s, appeared from the kitchen, holding an armful of silverware and cloth napkins. Her eyes centered quickly on him, and she addressed him with a casual but friendly attitude. "Hey there, just by yourself today?" "Yep, just eating some breakfast." "Well, you're at the right place. Sit anywhere you like. I'll put this down and get you a menu." He chose a nearby booth and seated himself. The waitress divested herself of her load, then retrieved a faux leather menu from a stack piled to the left of the register. She grabbed a full pot of coffee from its perch on the maker and brought it along the way over to him. "Coffee?" she questioned, proffering the pot. When he assented, she flipped open the cup in front of him and filled it to the brim with the steaming brown liquid. The menu was carefully placed in front of him for his perusal of its contents. She had a white name tag pinned to her blouse that simply read, "Sally." Sally talked as she worked, every movement and a word an economy of motion and thought. The special today is eggs and corned beef hash, served with hash browns and your choice of short stack of pancakes or toast. "Would you like anything else to drink this morning? Water or juice perhaps?" "No, the coffee's fine," Chris replied. "I'll give you a minute to decide and then I'll check back with you." She gave him a brief smile and then retreated back behind the counter. The menu held the normal staples of roadside cuisine, and after a quick look, he decided on the farmer's skillet. He studied the paintings as he waited for her to return, not in the least anxious or impatient by the wait. It had been a beautiful morning thus far, and he had no wish to spoil it with unnecessary urgency. All the artworks shared a common theme, that of landscapes and stills, and when there was a rare figure to be seen, it was a woodland creature of some sort. No sign of human likeness dotted any part of the informal gallery at all. There was a decrepit old barn quietly falling apart in a sea of emerald grain. A torrential rapid, its deadly current swiftly running past massive boulders and sunken foliage. A bull elk, its impressive rack of antlers defiantly scraping the nighttime sky above it. The style and form of each piece of art was similar, and the initials SG could be seen in the corner of each work. You can see now well the small handwritten price tags were displayed at the bottom of each artwork. The pricing seemed extremely reasonable, in spite of the fact that the works were all original canvases instead of prints. A short name in quotation marks identified every one of the artist's creations, titling the pieces with simple nomenclature such as Master of His Domain and Sunrise on the Missouri. The artist must be someone intimately involved with the diner, he conjectured, perhaps a relative of the owner or close friend. The wealth and variety of the pictures debated him, and when the waitress returned to take his order, he did not notice her presence until she spoke at his side. "Do you like the paintings?" Sally asked almost shyly. "Yes, they're very well done." He was a bit of an artist himself as well, but he kept that particular detail to himself. She smiled broadly at his reply, a sincere, involuntary response to his praise. Chris began to suspect who the mystery artist was, and his hypothesis was confirmed shortly thereafter. "Thank you, I did them." The revealing insight into her secret talents opened a floodgate within her, and Sally continued on, happy to discuss her interests. "I've always loved painting, ever since I was a little girl. My parents got me an easel and paints for Christmas one year. I must have used up the paper in just a few weeks." She gave a short laugh, then sobered up immediately thereafter as she continued speaking. "It's just so freeing, you know, to draw what you see, the way you see it, so you can share it with people. I love it. When Tom, he's the owner and cook as well, when he was hiring on here after Thelma retired, I got the job, and he let me display my paintings and even charge for them. He says that adds a touch of class to the place, but after the first few sold, I think he likes the commission. It gets even better." She laughed, a tinkling melody that was infectious in its nature, and Chris joined her briefly as merriment before asking a question of his own. "Were all the scenes from around here, or do you make them up?" "Everything is around here, or places I visited. There's the old Corbett farm. We still call it that, even though the family's all long gone now. That's Crackbriar Creek there. That one there is the woods outside Ashcroft. I went over there with a day trip and ended up painting them. They're kind of spooky, don't you think?" She studied the paintings with a faraway look in her eyes, and then she shook herself and snapped back at attention. "I'm sorry, here I am babbling about my paintings. You haven't got your breakfast going on the stove yet." "Perfectly fine. I was enjoying our talk. But since you mentioned it, I'll get the farmer's skillet. Does it come with toast?" "Sure does. What kind do you want?" "We have wheat, white, sourdough, rye, and English muffins. Fry the right things."
Probably a little bit.
"How about your eggs? Over hard is preferable." "That Tom can do." "Great, I'll get this for you." Sally beamed again as she parted to deliver his choices to the cook. Chris took a long pull of his mug, savoring the bitter flavor of the coffee. He studied more of the paintings as he waited for his breakfast. The activity had almost become a game to him to discover which artwork he enjoyed the best. There was a lone wolf howling dismally beneath a full moon on a dark hilltop. A stand of sunflowers, their bent yellow heads seemingly united in a prayer of thanksgiving, and an unimaginative fruit bowl filled with bananas, grapes, pears, and apples. That one was definitely his least favorite, he decided quickly upon his inspection. An elderly couple came in and sat down at the opposite wall, well away from his table. The young waitress attended to them with some efficiency and assurance she had shown within. More customers appeared, some travelers like himself, and others that wore the traditional coveralls and buttons shirts of farmers and ranch hands. He saw 2 plates go up in a tiny pass-through, and a small bell rang once to announce their arrival on the counter. Sally picked up the food and brought it over to him with a newly busy coffee pot. She arranged the plates neatly in front of him, the toast above the main course within handy reach, and then refilled his coffee cup. The smell wafting from the dishes was divine. Sally hovered briefly, anxious to attend all at once as well. "Do you need anything? Hot sauce for your hash browns or a side of gravy?" "I'll take you up on that water now." The coffee had been nice, but it left him wanting something more cool and refreshing. The water would do him good. He was probably more dehydrated from his activity of the previous night and the long drive than he knew. To oblige the request expediently, coming back with a tall glass filled with ice cubes and clear liquid. "Thanks," he said, just before taking his first invigorating sip. It seemed heavenly, and the light sampling turned into a greedy swallow quickly. "No problem," Sally responded politely, before returning to her other customers. His thirst slaked, Chris dug into the waiting skillet with an enthusiastic gusto. The eggs had been cooked to perfection, exactly the style he liked, done all the way through but not overcooked. The sausage, onions, and green peppers were similarly prepared, and the hash browns had just the right amount of brown crisp on the top, covering the golden goodness within. Rye bread had its wholesome taste enriched by the ambrosial thick dollops of butter that had been lathered upon its triangular sides. His ravenous appetite did not take long to demolish the pile of food before him. His hunger sated, Chris returned to his examination of the paintings. He was able to eliminate the possibilities of which one was his favorite down to the final 3, albeit not without some share of difficulty. Their own landscapes, the still lifes and animal pieces not particularly running in the veins of his personal tastes. The first contender was a billowing windmill, standing tall against a backdrop of blue sky and white clouds. An old barn lay beneath the windmill, And upon closer inspection, Sally managed to capture a town of sinister structures, as if it could take place anytime in the last 100 years. The title was George's Windmill, and he wondered briefly who the mystery man was. Perhaps he was a local farmer or another person as the waiter had come to know it. The second selection pictured a nighttime scene. It featured a curved path winding serpentine line through a thick grove of trees. The woods themselves were twisted and somewhat misshapen, reaching up in skeletal branches to the moonless sky above. Dim stars could be seen in that black sky, distant and cold in their separate nature from the teeming overgrowth below them. The passage itself was made of crushed sedimentary rock, such as shale or limestone, and was a whitish color, in sharp contrast to the darkness of the rest of the piece. Here and there, small tufts of grass and weeds forced their way through the stone layers of the footpath, fighting upward in life's eternal battles, order against chaos, entropy versus rejuvenation. The path went uphill along with its meandering weave, terminating at the far horizon where sky met earth. It was labeled starkly the trail less taken. Despite its vaguely foreboding aspect, Chris felt drawn towards the scene, almost invited to visit the shrouded solitude depicted in the painting. The last illustration was designated The Secret Place. The subject was a babbling brook framed by white-barked aspens and tall stands of verdant shrubs. In the foreground of the little stream was a small meadow, perhaps 12 feet across and similar in length. Soft grass covered the open area, lying like a iridescent blanket ready for a picnic. Sally had done an exceptional job in making the location appear both enticing and secretive, just as the name of the piece foretold. The hidden spot had an aura about it, that of serenity and peacefulness. It was a special place, one that should be visited only to refrain from spoiling its unblemished character by undue casualness and overfamiliarity of its hallowed grounds. Rio would have loved it. The thought came unbidden to the forefront of his mind, but he banished it as quickly as it had come. That time was past. He would waste no more of his attention on things that could never be again. Any pie for dessert? Sally had snuck up on him unawares like she did earlier, but he welcomed the distraction from his ruminations. No, I better not. Doctor's already warned me enough about the sugar. Chris smiled as he spoke to the young girl, and she repaid the favor. Just the bill, I guess. All right, then. She turned hastily to comply with his request, but then he stopped her. I do have another question. Is that a meadow in the painting nearby? Guess you're to the secret place. It's a bit out of the way, yes, but not too far. She leaned toward the conspiratorial. It's actually on private property, but the owners live in Washington. I've only seen it once or twice my whole life growing up here. I think it belonged to some kin of theirs and inherited it. Kept out of respect, or maybe just like the idea of having a place in Montana to tell their friends to look fancy, I guess. It's a big spread, and I found that place where I was exploring it. Just had to paint it. So pretty, isn't it? Makes you feel so safe and at ease. Figured what the rich folks don't know won't hurt them. Not like I'm trashing the place. Don't tell anyone, though. She gave him one of those delightful smiles again. Your secret's safe with me. I really like the picture. Tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'd like to visit the secret place, just once. You give me the directions there, and I'll buy your painting as well. Be a great memento and story, especially how I got to meet the talented artist that made it. Sally blushed, obviously not used to such praise. It did not take her long to consider his offer. Sure, you got yourself a deal, mister. She carefully took down the landscape from its place among the other artworks and wrapped it in plain partial paper. She tied it neatly at 4 points, ending in a looping bow. Then Chris saw her spend a few minutes jotting down the requested address. The delighted waitress brought the entire assemblage back over to him. He paid her in cash with a fairly substantial tip. She went over to the instruction with him, making sure he knew absolutely where he was heading, before thinking profusely one more time before he left the restaurant. Chris found the dirt road at the edge of the small collection of houses and trailers that almost could have passed for an actual town. The sky was a cloudless blue above it. All signs of the storm that made the muddy puddles were gone, blown away by the now gentle breezes. The roadway he drove on was rough, but not unduly so. He took the right turn on the fourth intersecting lane, right next to a crumbling barn, just as Sally had written in the directions. He stayed on it for several miles, crossing and recrossing meandering creeks and tributaries that streamed down the nearby mountains. He located the broken down tractor she had described and turned off into a disused, overgrown track just as past the spot of the machinery demise. He continued on for about 20 minutes until the thoroughfare petered out, coming to a halt at the dilapidated fence near the babbling brook of the picture. He parked underneath the wild profusion of emerald larches and aspens. Getting out of his vehicle and looking around, the very remoteness of the area struck him. No sign of civilization was in evidence at all, except for the derelict fencing and the faint trail he had followed on the way in. He strode into the forested land towards the creek and traced it upriver along its banks. After a few moments of careful walking, he stepped into an open meadow. He immediately recognized it for what it was, the very sight of the painting that had so captivated him. It's time for another drink. If he had considered the territory before being remote, this little patch made that seem almost exposed in comparison. The land surrounding the area rose up in the distance, creating a hollowing effect in the vicinity of the track's greenery. The swaying forest ringed around it like worshippers, paying homage in a respectful interval back from the object of their adoration. Chris breathed deeply. Even the scent felt sacred, clean and clear, devoid of the foul chemicals and artificial scents of the urban world. The only sound was the playful tone of the prattling rivulet and the gentle whispering of the snow-white trees as they responded to the subtle breezes. Maria would have loved it. The Arab thought had returned again, but this time he let it linger instead of exiling it back to the corners of his mind. She really would have loved it. She would have laid in the green grass and stared at the snapshot of sky framed by the surrounding aspens. He would have laid down next to her, holding her hand, content with each other, before she had said those hateful words, before she had left him. Chris ended the train of thought before it could come to its conclusion. Today was not to be the day for unwanted traipsing down distant memories and lost passions. He let himself instead be just in the wondrous scenery, enjoying the simple pleasure of the experience. He felt calmer than he had for months now, and he suddenly thanked the unknown waitress for the unexpected gift. Eventually, however, he pulled himself from the idyllic scene. Chris made his way back to the shaded trees to the waiting car. He looked around again briefly once more, trying to ascertain any prying eyes. Then he opened the trunk. He gazed down on the still figure within, blonde tresses covering the smashed face underneath. Maria, he thought. He carefully arranged the plastic sheeting in the body rested on, drawing it on top of the golden hair as not to dispel the illusion of quiet repose. The small fold-up shovel lay just beneath her, and he collected it before hoisting the sheathed load to his shoulder, clasping it rigidly with his left arm. Chris clumsily shut the truck with his right hand that held the tool he needed, and then hurriedly trotted to the relative safety of the distant growth by the stream. Chris laid her down on the cool green grass, then uncovered the plastic shroud around her face, brushed the loose blonde locks aside, letting her sightless eyes gaze at the sky above. He thought briefly of lying down with her, joining her in her silent repose, but then discarded the notion. There was still more work to do. He cut the saw and deliberately placed it to one side of his excavation. Then the real labor began. No matter where you dug in Montana, you could always hit a rock after a few inches, and this location was no different. He toiled for a couple hours, making sure he had suitable cavity for his purposes before depositing his charge into the new burial plot. Walking out a bit further from the meadow, he found several large rocks to cover the still form, to prevent predators from disturbing his creation. He backfilled the dirt afterwards, and then carefully arranged the hunks of thick grass on top so the edges could heal simultaneously. After he'd finished, he leaned back and inspected his work. At this time of year, a few rains should be more than enough to wash away any traces of his handiwork and give the vegetation a chance to knit itself back together. Even now, the signs of his destruction were minimal, and if the artistic waitress came here in the next few days, she would hardly think anything was amiss. Chris permitted himself a final moment of indulgence before he left, committing the scene to memory. Such a splendid, beautiful spot, it was almost a shame he could never return. The trip back to Ashcroft was uneventful, and he pulled into his concrete drive with little fanfare for his neighbors. Chris was not an active member of the community, like most of the denizens of the street. It was highly unlikely anyone even noticed he had gone for the weekend. He retrieved the rack partial and locked his car before going up to the stairs to his house. Later, Chris would need to go down to the car wash and vacuum his interior, but that could wait for a bit. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The normal silence of his solitary existence greeted him. Laying his burden down beside the black couch, He proceeded to the storage room and retrieved a hammer and small picture nail from his tools there. He tapped the walls behind the short curio cabinet and found a satisfactory stud to apply his peg on. Chris unwrapped the painting from its brown packaging and almost reverently hung the artwork on its waiting fastener. He positioned it this way and that until it suspended evenly on the wall. He then stood back to admire his handiwork. Just as Sally had her collection of art, he had his own. A myriad of creations lay either by the cabinet or in it and adorned the space behind the fixture. All were carefully arranged to show their best viewing point, and he lent himself to luxury regarding his trophies. Here was a sculpture from a gallery in Coeur d'Alene, near where he buried that pretty hitchhiker, an arrowhead he found after disposing of the school teacher in Shoto, and a brass wall hanging with a silhouette of a mining town, bought from a roadside antique store in Bismarck shortly after he'd stalked and murdered the proprietor's granddaughter almost 1,000 miles away. Many more treasures crowded the macabre accumulation, all with special meaning for Chris, a hidden reminder of his depraved conquests and terrible accomplishments. His keepsakes were completely unrelated to their victims to the casual eye. Indeed, on the rare times he had held social gatherings and small get-togethers, his guests raved over his curious tastes and choices in the realms of art. But there is one thing they can never understand. Even if they knew the unspeakable reason he collected such a wide variety of seemingly disconnected artifacts and creations, beyond even the horror of what discouraging sentimental value the pieces hold for the owner of such relics. It is that the woman behind the representations were all Maria to him, no matter their name, or the place they resided, or the kind of life they had lived before he came to put an end to it. She was the reason for his art, the inspiration. The rest were merely the medium from which he created his compositions. She was the one that launched his descent into madness that now consumes all his waking hours and every action. And the betrayal he felt from her, left unquenched even by her spilt blood he had shed years earlier, which forces him to reenact the same tortures and appalling eventualities over and over again. In a way, that's kind of answering like a question you had earlier. So, anybody here been to Avon? Yes? Okay, they have a diner there. There's artwork all over the walls. I was in there looking at all the artwork, and I saw a painting called The Secret Place, and that's where that story came from. So, because I was like, oh man. And then I was so disappointed because I came back later and wanted to buy it, and it was gone. Because I was like, wow, you give me such a good idea for a story, I want to have it now.
Where was it at?
It was in Avon.
Avon.
Yeah, it's just a little diner in there.
Oh,
Great food.
in
not gonna
Billings or
lie.
in Great Falls?
No.
No, it's in between Helena
And Deer
and
Lawn.
going toward Deer Lawn.
Oh, okay. I was
Yeah.
kind of geographic. I didn't know where we were.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's really
I've
out of
only
the
been
way
that way a
unless
few
you really need to
times.
go that way.
yeah.
It's really tiny town.
Yeah, they're on
Okay.
like 4 hours. But great diner.
Oh, that's cool.
Okay, well, thank you
Yeah, thank
so
you.
much. Can we do another round of applause, please? That was fantastic. No, the switch up, I was like, I knew it, but I didn't want to say it out loud. I was like, yeah.
It's
Just a
fun when you can
reminder.
figure it out, right?
Yeah. Just a reminder, we will have both of these books available next week for checkout. This one is the first one.
That is the first.
Yes, and then this one is the second one. So The Dreadful Call is first, Stained Echo is third, and then Sinister Traits, which came out yesterday. We will get this and
Thank
we
you.
will put it in our collection as well. So next week, come in to check these out. Or you might have to fight me at the front desk for them, but it's fine. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We have lots going on here at the library. On Saturday, I have the quilt project coming in from 1 to 4 o'clock. We have 2 story quilts that will be displayed down here in the Cordingly room with snacks and beverages available in the back. And those will be a pretty fun and exciting time for anybody who's interested in some Montana stories and putting them into quilt form as well. So that's 1 to 4 o'clock down here. And then in the morning, for anybody who has kiddos, we have a Halloween party going on Saturday morning. So if we don't have enough going on in this room, let's add some more. So costumes are highly encouraged for the kiddo Halloween party. Thank you all so much for coming out, and I hope to see you again.